United States gave a magnificent speech today, and I wish he would do this more often. I've told him and you this for months on the air. Speak to the American people in plain English. And that's what he did. And more people now understand what a disaster this phony Paris Agreement was. On the other hand, the President violated a promise he also made during the campaign with respect to moving America's embassy from Tel Aviv to Israel's capital. I'll get on to that later, but I want to address this so-called climate change issue and put it in a broader context. What's really going on here? You see, folks, for 100 years or more, there has been a movement in this country to destroy the republic, to destroy the civil society. For 100 years or more, there have been people in this country who've sought to copy the decentralized socialist model of Europe. Because after all, the ideas of Marxism and socialism come out of Europe. They've been imported into the United States. They're not indigenous to the United States. They called themselves progressives. I hate that. I mean, I have to play along so that's not confusing with respect to the nomenclature. But they're iron-fisted tyrants in many respects, and they're certainly not progressive. They're regressive. And while they wrap themselves in populist rhetoric, in the rhetoric of small d Democrats, their model is autocracy. Autocracy. Centralized government. Authoritarianism. Dictates, coercion, threats, fines, penalties. I challenge you to find really anywhere in private life today that doesn't have some aspect of government control, regulations, rules, what have you. Almost 4,000 laws imposed on this country, on we the people, by the bureaucracy every single year. 4,000. Is it really necessary? Can we not function on our own? Is not enough enough? We have states and localities that do pretty much the same thing. How many more? Well, there's always going to be more. Because the statists, that is the progressives, are all about controlling you. When you look at the progressive income tax, I said we're going to get broader in order to get narrower in a moment. The progressive income tax isn't about raising enough money to fund the government. It's the progressive income tax. It's about redistributing wealth. That's the main thing the federal government does today. Not defense, not infrastructure, redistributing wealth. Look at Obamacare. Obamacare is not about health care. It's about redistributing wealth. One of its architects, Donald Berwick, you'll remember, he was in England almost 10 years ago, celebrating then the 60th anniversary of socialist health care in Britain, which is a disaster. A disaster. I want to remind you of what he said, because it doesn't just apply to health care. It applies to so-called climate change. It applies to the progressive income tax. Cut 17, Mr. Producer, go.
You could have had a monstrous insurance industry of claims and rules and paper pushing instead of using your tax base to provide a single route of finance. You could have protected the wealthy and the well instead of recognizing that sick people tend to be poorer and that poor people tend to be sicker, and that any health care funding plan that is just, equitable, civilized, and humane must redistribute wealth from the richer among us to the poorer and the less fortunate. Excellent health care is by definition redistributional. Britain, you chose well.
Health care is just another tool, a massive tool, by which to impose the left's agenda. And so is this so-called climate change. In Liberty and Tyranny, I pointed out that the modern environmental movement was founded on one of the most egregious frauds in human history. That DDT is a human-killing poison when in fact it is a human-saving wonder chemical. A chemical compound developed in 1939 for use as an insecticide. DDT was critical in protecting American soldiers from typhus epidemic and malaria during World War II. In 1948, Paul Herman Muller received the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the high efficiency of DDT as a contact poison against several arthropods. I mean, only the lamest of the lame claim today that DDT was the kind of destructive poison, quote-unquote, that was claimed by Rachel Carson in 1962. I'm just giving you this as an example. As a result of the ban on DDT, ladies and gentlemen, millions of people have died in Africa and Southeast Asia, but particularly Africa, from malaria, from mosquitoes. Mosquito nets don't stop mosquitoes. We used to drop DDT on our playgrounds in this country, places like Boston. History lost. Journalist, best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell, who I'm sure you've heard of, recounted the successful eradication campaigns waged in Italy, Taiwan, the Caribbean, the Balkans, parts of northern Africa, the South Pacific, Australia, and India. He wrote, in India, where malaria infected an estimated 75 million and killed 800,000 every year, fatalities had dropped to zero by the early 60s. Between 1945 and 65, DDT saved millions, even tens of millions of lives around the world, perhaps more than any other man-made drug or chemical before or since. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because the environmental movement is part of an ideological movement. The national health care movement is part of an ideological movement. The progressive income tax is part of an ideological movement. That's why. And I could go on and on about DDT. You can read it yourself in Liberty and Tyranny. An entire chapter called Envirostatism. This environmental movement is cold-blooded. It's cold-blooded. Despite the deaths of millions of babies and others, they plow ahead. Pseudoscientists, phony scientists, go on and on about DDT. Nobody's saying you should drink it out of a bottle. But that's not how it's applied. And now we have this climate change. As you recall, was climate cooling, climate heating, now climate change. Doesn't matter. 1971, Dr. S.I. Razul, a NASA scientist, insisted that in the next 50 years, the fine dust man constantly puts into the atmosphere by fossil fuel burning could screen out so much sunlight that the average temperature could drop by 6 degrees. He was wrong, wasn't he? Further claimed that if sustained over several years, 5 or 10, such temperature decrease could be sufficient to trigger an ice age. That's a NASA scientist. Like that most scientists believe, or objective science tells us. And he used a computer model created by NASA colleague and current global warming mystic, Dr. James Hansen. So the global cooling alarm was sounded throughout the 70s. 1974, Time magazine, an article, Another Ice Age, which cited evidence purporting to show the atmosphere cooling for the previous 30 years. Quote, telltale signs of global cooling are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. And the article featured opinions from climate experts who suggested that mankind may be responsible for the Earth's cooling. Reed A. Bryson of the University of Wisconsin theorized that dust and other particles released into the atmosphere as a result of farming and fuel burning may be blocking more and more sunlight. 1975, scientists again raised the specter of global cooling. A famous article appearing in Newsweek magazine titled The Cooling World. Quote, the central fact is that after 3/4 of a century of extraordinary mild conditions, the Earth's climate seems to be cooling down. It continued, Meteorologists are almost unanimous in the view that the trend of global cooling will reduce agricultural productivity for the rest of the century. And it cited a survey completed in 1974 for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, revealing a drop of half a degree in the average group temperatures in northern hemisphere between 1945 and 1968. NOAA scientists had also concluded that, quote, the amount of sunshine reaching the ground in the continental United States diminished by 1.3% between 1964 and 72, unquote. Well, what happened to our grand science? So, of course, there's no new ice age. The almost unanimous opinion of weather experts about man-made global cooling was wrong. In 2008, the same Newsweek that gave weight to the false science of global cooling published an article titled Global Warming as a Cause of This Year's Extreme Weather. This is right out of Liberty and Tyranny. Great book, if I say so myself. But 1.4 million of you already know it because you bought it. It wrote mockingly, listen to this, in 2008 Newsweek, quote, it's almost a point of pride with climatologists. Whenever some place is hit with a heat wave, drought, killer storm, or other extreme weather, scientists trip over themselves to absolve global warming. No particular weather event, goes the mantra, can be blamed on something so general. Extreme weather occurred before humans began loading up the atmosphere with heat-trapping greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. So this storm or that heat wave can be the result of the same natural forces that prevailed 100 years ago. Random movements of air masses, unlucky confluences of high and low air pressure systems, rather than global warming. This pretense has worn thin, wrote Newsweek. And yet, there really is no consensus that man has influenced the Earth's temperature, or that the Earth's temperature is warmer now than in the past periods. MIT professor Richard Lindzen classified science consensus, quote-unquote, respecting global warming as unscientific. With respect to science, the assumption behind consensus is that science is a source of authority. Rather, it is a particularly effective approach to inquiry and analysis. Skepticism is essential to science. Consensus is foreign. When in 1988 Newsweek announced that all scientists agreed about global warming, this should have been a red flag of warning. Among other things, global warming is such a multifaceted issue that agreement on all or many aspects would be unreasonable. But it didn't stop John McCain from embracing it. It didn't stop then Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, from embracing it. It didn't even stop Newt Gingrich at the time from embracing it. All Republicans. They said the debate is over. Gingrich even said there must be a green conservatism. Green conservatism. You have lunatics like Al Gore out there pressing it. The late Scott Pelley of CBS trashing so-called climate deniers. If I do an interview with Elie Wiesel, am I required as a journalist to find a Holocaust denier? This isn't about politics or pseudoscience or conspiracy theory blogs. This is about sound science. Really. Dr. Edward Wegman. Stick with me. You'll learn more in this than anywhere else. Trust me. A professor at the Center for Computation Statistics at George Mason University, chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Applied Theoretical Statistics, and board member of the American Statistical Association, was tasked by a congressional committee to lead a group of experts in examining the hockey stick evidence of so-called global warming. Wegman reported back, quote, the assessments that the decade of the 90s was the hottest decade in a millennium and that 1998 was the hottest year in a millennium cannot be supported. The paucity of data in the more remote past makes the hottest in a millennium claims essentially unverifiable. Science, baby. Right? Science. Historic CO2, carbon dioxide, measurements are intentionally chosen to ensure that the data reflect an increase, such as ignoring CO2 measurements from the years 1857 to 1957, which may show higher concentrations of atmospheric CO2 than exist today. I'm going to give you a little bit more background and a little bit more context, and then a little bit of Donald Trump. I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.